Welcome to the Northeast Kingdom Voice. I'm your host, Scott Wheeler. Our guest today is Dan Taylor of St. Paul, Minnesota. Dan, who's a native of Barton, Vermont, is here to talk about some of the men from his home community of Barton who served in the Civil War. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back. Thank you.
Did you come way from St. Paul just to come on my show?
No, our family vacations in Barton, my hometown, every August. So it just worked out to get together today.
Right. So how has Barton changed since you left here in the 1970s?
Oh boy, it's changed a great deal.
Have you ever aspired to tell your wife that you're going to move back to Barton full time?
No, I don't think that's in the cards anytime soon. We like it in Minnesota, but Minnesota reminds me a lot of Vermont,
Right.
And it's just a great community to raise your kids.
Right. I remember how we first became connected. It was I did a story on your father in the Korean War,
That's
but
right.
then I did a short bit on you. You lived just a short distance away from the bridge that collapsed 5 years ago.
Yeah, indeed we do. It was 5 years ago last month
Right.
that the bridge collapsed.
And ever since then, you've been writing for my magazine, the Northland Journal.
Yeah, I think I've got about 16 articles about Barton that I've written over the years.
So why is it that Barton is still in your blood after so long? And just for the viewers, I've been to Dan's house several times, and it's kind of like going back into Barton's history because you don't just talk Barton, you live Barton over in Minnesota.
Well, you don't think that I have a shrine to Barton in my house
Well,
with
actually you do.
Barton maps and signs from Barton? You bet. I've always been interested in history, and anywhere I've ever lived, I've always dove into the local history. So Barton is no exception. Growing up in 7th grade, I remember reading about the Civil War and reading about the men who fought from Barton in the Civil War, and I just became interested in that.
So, in other words, as a kid, you were a freak like I
Totally.
like I was, because history isn't something that most kids can wrap their hands around, just because kids are here and now and maybe the future, but you got so much going on, you're not really concerned about the past. But besides that is some history teachers have such a way of making a really interesting topic really boring.
Yeah, exactly. But for me, it's going to those places where history was made that brings it to life for me. And so, Barton soldiers are no exception. Every year, a buddy of mine, we go to Civil War battlefields together. And whenever possible, I always try to find out those places where the soldiers from Barton once fought. And I've been to many of those places.
Did you have any relatives from Barton who fought in the Civil War?
Yeah, some distant relatives, but actually to get my first Civil War soldier in my family, I had to marry my wife. She has a great-grandfather who fought for the Union.
So who did he fight for? Was he from Minnesota?
No, he was from the 12th Indiana Cavalry. Yeah.
So tell me, were there more people from Barton who served in the Civil War than other communities, or was it pretty much the norm?
Well, every community in Vermont had to come up with a quota of men based on their population and how many eligible men there were in that town. So over the course of the 4 years of the Civil War, Barton sent the town of Barton, which would include the Orleans and the village of Barton, they sent 182 men off to the Civil War.
How many didn't return?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but I know of at least 3 that were killed in action.
Did they go willingly, or was it like they went kicking and screaming?
Well, there was a draft during the Civil War, but I think most men at that time went very willingly. One of the first persons I wanted to talk about in terms of soldiers from Barton was a guy, his name was Carlos McDaniel.
Right.
And Carlos, to me, was the epitome of a soldier from Barton in the sense that very little was known about him. We know from the 1860 census that he was the youngest child, lived on a affluent farm out on the May Road in Barton. But who knows what really drove him to become a soldier in the Civil War? Was it out of a sense of duty? Probably, because you got to remember, at the time of the Civil War, the railroad had made its way up to Barton, and it was the northernmost station on that railroad. So any recruits coming out of Canaan or North Troy, Derby, they all had to come down to Barton to catch the train to go off to their training camps in Brattleboro and Rutland. So Carlos McDaniel, I'm sure, was sitting on his farm at the age of 22 thinking, well, these guys are going off on an adventure. Right. So I think he probably did it out of a sense of duty. Maybe he was an abolitionist, right, because Vermont was the first state in the Union to ban slavery. But more so, he did it out of a sense of duty or perhaps boredom. Right. You know, he enlisted in February of 1862, and you know, that farm probably got pretty cold and not much going on. And so he probably thought, well, let's go off to war.
My great-great-grandfather, Sullivan Church,
yes,
he went off to fight when he was 15 years old. He was in the 9th Vermont, and they did a whole lot of traveling, but they really didn't do that much fighting because they were captured at Harper's Ferry. And then once he was out of prison in Chicago, he did a lot more traveling. But my wife is often fond of saying that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, because when he returned home, he was suffering some, well, I'm not sure which one it was. Was it having like 6 kids in like 7 years?
Wow.
Or was it the impact of the war? But he was insane by the time he was in his early 30s. Now, having 6 kids in 7 years could probably do that to you.
Wow.
But he actually died in an insane asylum in his early 30s, and his war record said he died due to diseases of the brain brought on by the war, because it was malaria.
Sure.
Because you think of Civil War deaths.
Yep.
You think of gunshots, cannon, but you know as well as I do that there was a lot of soldiers who died due to disease.
Most of the casualties of the Civil War were due to a disease that they encountered in camp. And in fact, Carlos McDaniel was one of those. 9 months after he enlisted, he died of typhoid fever. He joined up with the 7th Vermont Regiment, who were assigned duty down in New Orleans, and the malaria and the fever got to him, and he died in November of 1862. I remember on one of my trips to New Orleans, going out to his gravesite, and I brought a picture of it, actually.
Okay, we'll actually, after you get done that story, let's start with the photos and
Sure.
talk about those a little bit. So you found what in New Orleans?
Well, you know, when I go out to Civil War battlefields, again, I like to look for the places where Vermont soldiers had been. And Carlos McDaniels, I knew, was buried at Chalmette National Cemetery, just outside of New Orleans. And so I went to look for his grave, and it became a bigger undertaking than I thought originally. I brought a picture of his tombstone because over the years it's faded and became hardly legible.
So this is what we're looking at right now?
Yeah, it's his tombstone. You can barely make out the letters, Carlos McDaniel. You can see that he served in Vermont, and he's one of over 300 men from Vermont buried in that cemetery.
Right. You know, maybe you're going to go on. Are you going to talk about Mosby's Rangers?
Sure.
Oh, yeah. You are going to be talking
Absolutely.
about that? Oh, okay. So I'll let you go on with these photos, and I won't jump in so much.
No problem.
So what about this photo?
Well, you know, my buddy Mark David and we searched all over this cemetery looking for it, and the thought struck me, I wonder how many people in 150 years since his death came looking for his grave. You know, perhaps we were the only ones ever to go looking for him. But, you know, standing there, I just have these sobering thoughts of, here's a man a young kid actually, 22 years of age, who grew up in the same community, who looked at the same mountains, probably went swimming in Crystal Lake, just like I did, and here he was dead from disease and a soldier in the Civil War.
Okay, yeah, that is an interesting point. And sometimes they didn't. They were actually buried in mass graves.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have identification on them. I was just watching a documentary on the Civil War, and they were saying how a lot of them would actually put their name and hometown in their pocket. They're just because they didn't want to be buried in a pauper's grave, because they all, when they, like when we think in today's wars, when we think of a lot of people dying, if one soldier dies, that makes the news.
Right.
How many people were dying in some of these battles?
Oh, well, we'll talk a few moments from now about Ellery Webster, but he wrote a letter home that from Cold Harbor that talked about 6 of his comrades, all from the Northeast Kingdom, being killed in one battle.
And just think of all the hundreds of people who died in these battles.
Oh, totally. Going off to war and never coming home was a thought that entered everybody's mind. And one person from Barton in particular, George W. Quimby, he was a native of Lyndonville, but he moved to Barton to study law under John Sartell, who was a famous lawyer at the time. He moved to Barton, took a job as principal of Barton Academy, but one thing that he said was, I don't want to wait for the draft. If I'm going to lose my life, I'm going to do it as a volunteer soldier.
Is this next photo, is that like day-to-day life in a Civil War encampment?
Yeah, it is indeed. Being a soldier in the Civil War was not glorious most of the time. In fact, George Quimby was a prolific writer. We have over 20 of his letters. It's in a collection at the University of Vermont. But we have over 20 of his letters, and I wanted to read one today that talked about camp life.
That's from one of your articles you published in my magazine.
Yeah, I'm going to read it straight from the journal, if that's okay.
Right, go right ahead.
George Quimby writes January 20th, 1862. My dear sister Emmeline, it is lonesome and dull tonight, and I think I can do no better than to write you while it rains. You have no idea away off in snowy Vermont of how deep the mud is here. Last Monday night it snowed some 2 or 3 inches, and the next day was very cold and froze the ground to some little depth, and the next day after that it rained and rained most of the time since, making our encampment, though very dry in my tent, a perfect mud hole, and so we have nothing to do but sit in our tent and let it rain. You ought to see a chair I made yesterday out of a flour barrel. I took and sawed part of the staves off halfway down and then made a bottom to it, and now can sit as comfortable as not quite though in my rocking chair in that well-remembered chamber in Barton. It gets to be rather dull sometimes when we think how little we are really doing, and gloomy enough when we see how many are dying. 6 have died in our regiment during the last week alone. One in our company, who enlisted after arriving in Brattleboro, where they trained, he was sick but a few days, but with a typhoid fever, and proves fatal here most always. 7 had died from our company, and over 40 from the regiment. There can be no advancement for some time yet, for it will be impossible to move in such miserable mud. So the life of a soldier was not that glorious.
And they weren't fighting every single day. I know sometimes they went weeks without fighting.
Right, exactly. But this picture of George Quimby, he's the guy in the middle, surrounded by the officers of his company of the 4th Vermont Regiment. But that's a typical camp photograph.
Then I know, because there was a lot of photographs of the Civil War, including there were people who would go in and photograph the aftermath of the battles, and they showed the carnage of and that was back before they had the painkillers. So you had people's limbs were cut off by the hundreds,
Oh, yeah.
and they had little in the way of painkiller other than maybe a little bit of whiskey.
Yeah, exactly right. You know, Quimby first saw action at the Battle of Lee's Mills in Virginia, and that's where the 4th Vermont experienced a number of casualties. And he writes in his letters about seeing men dead and dying. The 4th Vermont was also at Antietam, which 150th anniversary is coming up next month. But he writes that at Antietam he was in the hospital during that battle, so he didn't fight at the battle, but he was there days later and saw the dead still strewn along the battlefield and awaiting burial.
So the third photo, who is this?
Yeah, that's another picture of Quimby. It was taken in a photograph studio in Annapolis, Maryland. So this would have been taken of him right at the time of the Battle of Antietam.
Is the fourth one here? Is that also George Quimby?
No, that's a gentleman we'll get to in just a moment. I wanted to mention though that that Quimby later fought in battles throughout the Peninsula Campaign of 1862. But in December of that same year, he and his regiment, the 4th Vermont, was at Fredericksburg, and he was assigned under General George Meade to do a flanking movement at the battle and with the 4th Vermont, and he was struck by a bullet in the neck and killed in action. By all accounts, he was dead before he hit the ground. Word came back from the battlefield. His body came back to Lyndonville, where it was buried. But more than anyone else in our community, I think the death of George W. Quimby brought a sobering reality to the citizens of Barton that, you know, this is war. Yeah. You know, you mentioned the fourth photograph. That
right, so the fourth, that's this one.
Yeah, this one is a picture of William Grout, who was an attorney in Barton at the time of the Civil War when it broke out. He had a lot of political ambitions, but when the 15th Vermont Regiment was being assembled, William Grout, shown here in his uniform, he became an officer. He was an elected lieutenant and went off to war. Now, if you're going to be in any Vermont regiment, probably the 15th Vermont would have been the one to be in. They saw very little action. They were stationed in northern Virginia for most of the war, and it was just it was a 9-month enlistment as well, so they didn't serve out over a year like many of the others. But he was in charge of the 15th Vermont Regiment, and they protected the approaches to Washington, D.C. from rebel invasion.
Now, didn't you once tell me that is the brother of Governor Grout?
Yeah, Josiah Grout was William Grout's brother, right. And he was wounded in the war.
The governor was?
The governor.
Before he was a governor.
Before he was a governor, he was wounded in the war, and everyone thought he was going to die of his wounds, but he miraculously survived and later became governor. But Grout, he also had political ambitions, and after the war, well, you know, even before the war ended, the 15th Vermont mustered out after Gettysburg in the summer of 1863, and they all came home to Vermont. But in the fall of '64, that's when the St. Albans raid occurred, and the Vermont legislature assembled the militia. They called out the militia, and at that time, they were worried about invasion from Canada, right. Down into northern Vermont. So they called out the militia and appointed William Grout general, and that was the title that he kept for the rest of his life. But after the war, he became a congressman, serving Vermont in the United States House of Representatives. He served there for 18 years, first being elected in 1880, and then when Senator Justin Morrill passed away in office around 1900, Grout, Congressman Grout, and you can see his picture.
Now that's the next photo.
Yeah, the next photo is Grout as a congressman.
Oh, he still looks every bit of the soldier though.
I think so too. But
Now, were there a lot of Civil War veterans at that period of time who were serving in probably in Washington D.C.? I would imagine there were quite a few.
From both sides. I mean, once the Union
I never
was
thought
saved.
about that. Yeah.
Yeah, once the Union was saved, you had both Northern and Confederate men serving in Congress yet again.
Right. So did he remain in this area all of his life, other than being in Washington D.C.?
Yeah. Well, after he lost, he wanted to be senator, the successor to Senator Morrill in 1900, but the Vermont legislature, who had to elect the person to serve out the remainder of the term, they didn't choose Grout, and that greatly disappointed him. And some would say that crushed all of his ambition for higher office. And he retired to the ancestral farm down in Kirby, just outside of St. Johnsbury. And in 1902, he passed away. Yeah.
Okay, what about this next picture?
Yeah.
Who is that?
Well, this is a photograph of Joseph Webster. He was a transplant to Barton. He grew up in Irisburg, but just prior to the war, Joseph Webster became a wood turner at a chair manufacturing company in Barton. And at the outbreak of the Civil War, he too joined the 15th Vermont Regiment, serving under William Grout.
Right.
Again, they were mostly stationed in Northern Virginia. In December of 1862, Jeb Stuart tried to come up and hold some raids in Northern Virginia. And it was the 15th Vermont Regiment that is credited with blocking their passage to Washington, D.C.
So did he make it home safely?
J.N. Webster did make it home safe, and after the war, he became a photographer. He became he was influenced by what he saw in the war, by photographers and pictures of soldiers, and he wanted to bring that home, and he opened a studio in 1864 in Barton.
Now, if I recall right, in your living room, don't you have a big Webster sign?
I do, yeah.
Is that from his business?
Yeah, I have the sign from J.N. Webster's photographic studio hanging in my house.
That's what I kind of thought.
Yeah.
So that the viewers can now understand that there is a little piece of Barton resting over there in St. Paul, because you've made yourself a little shrine to your hometown community.
I think I have. I have almost 100 images of J.N. Webster's photographs, and he is credited with taking some of the earliest photographs of Barton, and some of the earliest photographs of the Northeast Kingdom and New Hampshire.
You've often fascinated me about your ability for details, because I call myself a chronicler of history. I like to be able to talk to my history, sit down with the people who lived it. Well, needless to say, Civil War veterans, I can't do that. But you can come up with all these obscure facts. You know where to look, and I know I often turn to you, but how do you do it?
Well, I do a lot of reading. One of my favorite pastimes is to look at the old Orleans County Monitor newspapers and do some reading. And it was there that I actually found one of the greatest pieces of Civil War stories from a guy in Barton, and that was William Daniels. I came across this obscure article in March of 1865 that talked about William Daniels being released from Libby prison. And once I started to look into it, it became, in my opinion, it's one of the most fascinating stories of the Civil War. William Daniels was born in Barton. Early in his life, he fell in love with a woman named Gracie Forrest from Sutton. And so they started a family in Sutton. But within 18 months of their marriage, she passed away, and it was right at the start of the Civil War. So here we have a grieving widower with his wife just passing away. It's interesting. Just 2 days ago, I was out at Sutton and I was walking through the cemetery and I found her grave. Right next to her grave is the grave of Willie Daniels, 6-month-old son of William Daniels and Gracie. So not only did he lose a young infant, but he lost his wife in a short amount of time. So it was right about that time when Lincoln set out his call for troops. And William Daniels decided to serve his country and enlisted in the 1st Vermont Cavalry and was shipped off to Washington, D.C. Now, the 1st Vermont, they had a prolific career in the war. They spent all 4 years in the war and experienced about 75 different engagements, many of which William Daniels was there. Probably the worst engagement that they had was at Miskel's Farm in northern Virginia. Some people refer to it as the Battle of Broad Run, but Mosby, they were on the trail of John Singleton Mosby, who was a Confederate partisan leader who had a bunch of Rangers that were doing guerrilla warfare type maneuvers in that area. Well, he was public enemy number 1, and the first Vermont Cavalry went out to trap him, and they trapped him at Miskel's Farm. And on April 1st, 1863, they find him encamped in this farmyard, and they go charging in, bayonets swaying, guns blasting. And around the farm was this high fence. It's no longer there. I looked for it. But this high fence, and they came charging through, opened the gate, and somehow the gate got closed behind them. So there was no escape. Well, Mosby's men kept firing at the 1st Vermont, and the men started dropping left and right. And one who was mortally killed was Henry Flint, Captain Henry Flint from Irisburg. William Daniels was a friend of his, loved this man, and also wounded in that battle was your Josiah Grout. And they thought he was mortally wounded, but again, he miraculously became better. Anyway, William Daniels was asked to accompany the body of Henry Flint back to Irisburg for burial. And it was at that time that he met the sister of Henry Flint. Her name was Martha. And after the war, the two of them got married and named their first child Henry in honor of Henry Flint.
Now, so what is this a photo of?
This is a this is a photo of the raffle that William Daniels was in. Let's back up a little bit before we get to that photo. You know, in the fall of 1864, he was stationed in the Shenandoah Valley, and it was the war was turning atrocious at that point. Farmyards were being burned by the Union Army because they just wanted to do a scorched earth campaign through that area. But General Custer, who was also operating in that area and was in charge of the 1st Vermont at that time, he rounded up some captured soldiers of Mosby's, and in September of 1864 had them hung from Front Royal, Virginia, for war crimes.
Right.
Well, this was a new chapter in atrocious behavior. And so Mosby at that time wrote to General Robert E. Lee and said, I intend to take some captive soldiers of Custer's and hang 7 of them in retaliation. So that was the scene that was transpiring in that fall of 1864. The first week of November of 1864, General Custer assembled 150 men to accompany him up to Mechanicsburg, West Virginia. There he was going to meet his wife. He married Libby Custer just 9 months earlier.
Right.
and his wife wanted to come out to where he was camped. So 150 men go up to Martinsburg, West Virginia, meet her at the depot. The next day, they start heading back to their camp on Cedar Creek in Virginia. When they're just 4 miles away from getting back to their camp, Custer remembers that he forgot something in Martinsburg. He left something behind, and nobody really knows what was left behind. But he asked for 5 volunteers to go back and get it. Well, William Daniels was one of them that volunteered. And no sooner had they left the main body than 75 rebel cavalrymen came up, shots being fired. Daniels had his horse shot out from underneath him, the bullet lodging in his right foot, and he was captured by Mosby's Rangers. He was taken to a place called Rectortown, about 20 miles away, and there he was put with other captured soldiers. Long about noon on that day, this was November 6, 1864, long about noon, the Rangers come and they assemble all the captive men, and they announce to them, General Custer has hung 7 of our men, and we intend to hang 7 of you because we know you're under Custer's command. Well, you can imagine the men were just aghast. But this photo, number 7, is the field as it looks today where that raffle took place. They assembled all 27 men, and in a hat, they put 27 pieces of paper. 7 of them had a number on it. And if you drew a number, you were one of the condemned to be hanged.
In other words, you were not very happy.
You were not very happy. And William Daniels was one of the unfortunate men who drew a number. And he said, I'd never won anything in my life, but today I won this raffle.
So was he executed?
Good question. Well, this scene is, you can go to this field now. It's right behind the post office in Rectortown, Virginia. And the next photo is a artist rendering of that raffle. You can see the men, reaching into the hat and pulling out a number. Well, William Daniels was marched off with these 7 condemned prisoners, and they were ordered to get as close to Winchester, Virginia, where Sheridan had his headquarters, get as close to Sheridan and then hang these guys. So they were marching all day, and around a small community called Paris, Virginia, they took a break. Well, along comes this Confederate captain. His name was Richard Mountjoy, and he was bringing prisoners back himself from the Shenandoah Valley. Well, Mountjoy is looking at these guys, and he has a fraternal Freemason pin on his lapel. And he's looking at these men, and one of the guys is flashing him a hand signal, which is a secret signal that Masons have that show that they're in distress. Well, Mountjoy, realizing that there's a brother Mason here that is in distress, he wanted to exchange him for one of his prisoners. Well, he goes up to the rebel captain in charge, and as he's walking by these condemned prisoners, he sees William Daniels in his Vermont cavalry cap, and he instantly is brought back to a battle that he fought with the Vermont 1st Cavalry at Catlet Station about 9 months earlier. During that battle of Catlet Station, Mountjoy was captured by Vermont 1st Cavalry and some boys from Michigan. I think it was the 5th Michigan. Anyway, the Michigan guys wanted to kill all their prisoners, but it was the 1st Vermont Cavalry that said, no, we'll just capture them. And they, in essence, they saved Mountjoy's life.
Right.
So he sees this guy from the 1st Vermont, and he says to the rebel captain in charge, I want to exchange these 2 guys for 2 of my prisoners that I just picked up in the Shenandoah Valley. Well, they got into a heated argument, but Mountjoy outranked the guy, and he got his wish. So Daniels was spared by the favor of Captain Mountjoy.
Well, but I'm sure the guy that he was traded with, I'm sure he wasn't impressed, though.
I don't think he was terribly impressed. I don't think he probably knew what was going on. But those 7 condemned prisoners were marched towards Winchester. 3 of them were hung. 2 of them eventually escaped in the darkness, and 2 others were shot but survived.
You know, you've been able to unravel so many mysteries, whether it's to do with the Civil War or any other thing, just because of your research skills. But I went to you back a few weeks ago, and not even the famous Dan Taylor could unravel the mystery of a Derby man,
Yes.
of a true. Well, he will probably forever be a mystery. I can't recall his Mr. Lindsay.
Mr. Lindsay, yeah.
Who he owned factories. He was an inventor. He was born and raised in Derby. He ended up coming back and dying in Derby. And you know, I showed you his obituary.
Yes.
And it showed no indicators that he served in the military, but his obituary showed somebody who was ingrained with Lincoln's administration.
Right.
We do know that he was an inventor who invented guns and produced guns for the Union.
Right.
But the thing is he as a Union man was in places that probably he really shouldn't have been, what do you really think he was up to? Was he a spy? Was he some kind of infiltrator?
Boy,
you know, within the Union? Because he seemed to have traveled, you know, within Lincoln's group.
Yep.
But then he
went behind the lines of the Confederate, behind Confederate lines. Was he a spy? You know, this fellow Lindsay is a big mystery, and I looked to see if I could find a story about this man, and there's very little to be found.
Yeah, and you know, I'm gonna send that story to other people, just see if they can help. But I have a feeling that this will just forever go down into the pages of. We'll never know.
We'll never know.
Okay, with time, you know, nearing an end. Who's this next fella here?
Yeah, well, you know, one of the guys from Barton his name was Ellery Webster.
Right.
And Ellery Webster, born in Irisburg, but after the war he became a successful newspaper man in Barton. And so we now claim him as one of our own.
Was he the Orleans County Record?
He founded in 1872 the Orleans County Monitor.
Yeah, the Orleans County. Yeah, the Orleans County Monitor.
Yep. And that newspaper went on for 80 years in that.
That was a great
community.
paper too.
That was a great paper. But Ellery Webster founded
to that paper? How come it folded?
Oh, you know, I don't really know the answer to why it folded. You know, it lasted through 1952. But I don't know.
I kind of see that as more of like comparing today the Daily Express to the Chronicle. The Daily Express has their place, the Chronicle has their place, but I kind of envision the Monitor as being like the Chronicle, whereas it wasn't produced every day, so the stories were more. Yeah, they were fleshed out a little more.
Yeah, it was a weekly paper, and the thing I like reading is the society page. You know, what people are doing in the community, and that's what used to sell newspapers back then, is to see your name in print and find out what your neighbors are up to. But Ellery Webster, when he enlisted for Irisburg, and he became a member of the 11th Vermont Regiment, and they had a quiet career early on in their enlistment. They were stationed outside of Washington, D.C. There was a series of forts all around the capital, and the 11th Vermont was stationed there. But when Grant was called up to be commander of the Army of the Potomac in 1864, the 11th Vermont followed them into action in what became known as the Overland Campaign. And so you started off with the Battle of the Wilderness and Cold Harbor, and just points south towards Richmond in an effort to capture the capital. And Ellery Webster in the 11th Vermont joined them. I want to read to you, if we have time, just a short letter that he wrote right after the Battle of Cold Harbor. Again, I wrote about Ellery Webster in the journal, and I'll read his letter from those pages. He writes on June 5th, 1864, "Dear Father, I believe there's going to be a chance to send letters again today, so I must not fail to let you know that I am in the land of the living. We had a very severe battle between 1 o'clock and dark the first day of June, in which Sergeants A.W. Howard of Iresburg, A.V. Priest of Coventry, Privates Horace Sulman of Greensboro, George Heath of Brownington, Edwin Merrill Macris of Newport, and Ferdinand Wheeler were all killed, and 22 others were wounded. We are having a pretty hard time just now, lying on the ground nights when we are not on the march, without anything over us, building breastworks and keeping watch of the Johnnies daytime. I hope I shall never be in another battle where bullets fly as they did by spells on the first day of June, 1864. Imagine how it looks on smooth water when it rains, and you have something of an idea how the ground looked around us when the bullets struck. There has been fighting every day since the first, and today the skirmishers are keeping up a lively musketry crackle. We are laying behind our breastworks, and as the bullets go over our heads, they make a ringing that makes the boys occasionally squat and make them bow. But I hope this campaign will end the war, as I believe it will." You know, not too many letters deal with those kinds of scenes of battles. But Ellery was, again, he was a prolific writer. And writing from Cold Harbor, that was his experience.
I wonder if today's veterans write as much as they do, or at least in such detail, or do you have the people marking everything, blanking out everything, because you probably couldn't go into the kind of detail that they went into.
Yeah, it would be interesting to find, to ask modern day veterans, with the age of the internet and email and Skype, if they have these kinds of memories and preserved.
Yeah, because I think that's those letters or diary entries of any kind, whether it's Civil War or not, those are what truly brings history to life.
Right.
Because without it, with everybody gone now, a lot of it is, well, not a lot of it, at least a portion of it is conjecture, but at least if you put it into, what I tell people is you better put your memories into writing, because after you're gone, people are going to make up things about you anyways.
Right.
So you might as well record it now.
Yeah, well, Ellery Webster was a great recorder of what he experienced. In fact, around the 1900s, turn of the century, in his own paper that he founded, he wrote down his memories and reminiscence of the war. And I mentioned he was in the Overland Campaign, and in June of 1864, they were on the outskirts of Petersburg, Virginia, where that city had been laid to siege. And on June 23rd, which is a dark day in Vermont history, over 400 Vermonters were captured that day at the Weldon Railroad. And Ellery Webster in the 11th Vermont was one of them. And he was shipped off on a train going south, and his destination was Andersonville Prison.
And Andersonville wasn't a place that you wanted to be. How many people died there?
Oh, thousands died. He in his reminiscence would comment about overnight the men who had died would be stacked up by the gates of Andersonville, and waiting their turn to be brought out and buried in mass graves in their cemetery, which you can still visit today.
We always hear about Andersonville. We always hear about how the enemy treated us.
Yeah.
But did we have anything that would have been compared to Andersonville? Did the Union?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we had our own skeletons in the closet, so to speak. I mean, we had prisoner of war camps in Elmira, New York, outside of Chicago, Illinois, Rock Island, Illinois, and those men suffered. They suffered for lack of food, lack of shelter. We have our own guilt in the treatment of prisoners as well.
Now, this final photo, who are these two men?
Yeah, this is a picture of Ellery Webster.
Well, I guess you have one more photo.
Yeah, there's a couple of
after.
photos that I'll share of Ellery Webster. This is Ellery Webster standing next to his brother Albert in their Union uniforms. This was taken in March of 1865 by his brother J.N. Webster in Barton at his studio. This was taken after Ellery came out of Andersonville prison and was recuperating. When he left Andersonville, he weighed just 70 pounds. Wow. If he had been in there just another couple of weeks, he probably wouldn't have made it. And in fact, there was about 51 men of his company that were captured at the Weldon Railroad that day, and less than a dozen survived their captivity in rebel prisons. Albert, his brother, was also captured in late March of 1865, but by then the war was almost over. 2 weeks later, Lee surrendered, and so Albert was only held in a prisoner of war camp for only 5 days before he was released. And then, you know, Ellery Webster went on to become a great businessman.
And this is him in his
older age. Yeah, the last picture I have is of Ellery Webster when he was an older man. After selling off his paper, the Orleans County Monitor, he became postmaster in Barton and served as postmaster for almost 30 years. He died in 1909, and his family says that he died of illnesses and injuries he received as a prisoner of war.
Yeah, because a lot of, war injuries, they might not kill you at the time, but there are still like Vietnam War veterans who are dying today because of, say, Agent Orange.
Definitely.
And everything. So, so he probably was a casualty of the war in a roundabout way.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
So, so these are just some of the people who served in the war from Barton. What is your, what's next for you?
What's next? Well, I still look for stories, particularly of soldiers from Barton in the Civil War. So I bet there's a few more stories to be told.
Right. And where's your next trip to the Civil War grounds?
I think in the spring we'll be heading off to Missouri.
Missouri.
To look at some battlefields there.
You must be going to, are you going to where Brown did his raid at the beginning of the war?
Oh, in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Right. I've been to Harper's Ferry, but the places that I think we'll look at are Wilson's Creek in Springfield, Missouri. We'll go down to some battlefields in Arkansas as well.
Do you ever go to any that just do not, you go all excited, but you get there and you realize they haven't really done anything?
Well, yeah, probably the biggest disappointment for me was in Tupelo, Mississippi, the home of Elvis. Right. There was a huge battle fought there in the middle part of the war, and so we went to that battlefield, and it's literally the size of this studio, right, with a flagpole and a plaque that says this was the site of the Battle of Tupelo. It was very disappointing.
Right. In closing, I'm sure you read an article that was in the journal that you didn't write about that person who he was saved by a wife. He was a Union soldier from, I believe it was Westfield. He was saved by a Confederate officer's wife when he was injured. Yes. She helped him, and she broke laws that would have had her executed, and he managed to get back home. But not only did he manage to get back home, but he managed to get not only her up to Westfield, but also her husband, where the Confederate soldier, the Confederate officer, he came up here and remained here the rest of the war. Yeah. But when they returned, they were not returning heroes because they were viewed as traitors.
Right, yeah, secessionists. Right. Yeah,
oh,
it's a fascinating story.
One thing though, with the Civil War, we've got to mention, because the viewers might not realize it, is Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy.
Yeah.
He ended up for a time right across the border
Right
here
across the
in
border.
Quebec.
That's right.
Where he settled for a time.
For a time. Yeah.
So we have that connection to the Civil War.
Totally. Yes.
So,
yeah.
Well, Dan, I think it's about time to wrap up, because I know we could go on.
We could go on forever,
because you're one of the most knowledgeable people when it comes to Barton. You have so much passion. And, now tell me, you're from St. Paul now. Is your heart and soul into the history of St. Paul as much? I know you brought me to the big museum out there.
Yeah, right.
But the thing is this is where your roots are.
Yeah, totally. No, my passion is still about Barton and its histories. But if your viewers want to investigate more stories of the Civil War, I would point them to a great website. It's www.vermontcivilwar.org,
Right.
and you can find out all sorts of information about Vermonters in the Civil War.
Right, and to the viewers, if you have any great stories that come from Barton about the Civil War,
please let me know.
how can somebody contact you?
My email address is djtaylor@stthomas.edu. I'd love to hear from you.
Right. What about a phone number? Because not everybody.
Not everybody has internet.
Has internet. So what about a phone number?
Yeah, my phone number is 651-962-6671.
Right. Okay.
Great.
Let's wrap this up, and next year you will be back on, and you have an entire year to figure out what topic you'll be talking about.
I'd love to do it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
And thank you to the viewers for tuning in to another segment of the Northeast Kingdom Voice.